Todd Jones was born in Tallahassee, Florida, and is based in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's a visiting assistant professor and gallery director for the art department at Meredith College. Todd received his BFA with a double major in studio art and psychology from Florida State University, an MFA in painting and drawing, and graduate certificate in visual arts management from Ohio University. Todd's been an artist in residence at Wild Acres in Little Switzerland, North Carolina, the Hambridge Center in Raven Gap, Georgia, Studio 209 in Thomasville, Georgia, and attended the Summer Painting Sculpture Intensive at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. He was a 2022 William and Dorothy Yeck Award finalist for Miami University, for Miami University's Young Painters Competition, and a 5th edition of the Boynes Emerging Artist Award finalist. Todd has had solo exhibitions at 621 Gallery in Tallahassee, the Trussellini Gallery at Ohio University, along with the Emergent Arts and Crafts Gallery, the City Center Gallery in the Urban Art Space, and Wild Goose Creative in Columbus, Ohio. No further ado, please welcome Todd Jones.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Elon University for inviting me out here to give this talk and also to showcase my work here for you guys. So just kind of going through some things. I'll kind of start from the beginning, I think talking about the end of my undergraduate career into how we got here now. So I'll kind of break that up and show you some current works and talk about some overall conceptual development and things with my work as well. So as Michael said, my name is Todd Jones. I'm a visiting assistant professor at Meredith College, where I'm also the gallery director there. And yeah, I'm fairly new to the South area. I've only been in Raleigh for going on my 2nd year now. So kind of going through here, I feel like I have to start with the end of my undergraduate career. I went to Florida State University and got my BFA, not only in studio art, but also psychology. And when I was there, some of the best advice I got from a mentor was that your practice doesn't necessarily have to be separate. And that was something that I was kind of balancing out being an artist, but then debating if I wanted to go with something more research-based, something with psychology. So I decided to kind of combine those two things together. And one thing that really stuck out to me was I've always enjoyed experimental approaches to art making. Especially, I was a figurative artist, but I was always trying to figure out something else to take my work further. So what I started to do was to use paper marbling, as you can see here in this slide. So what paper marbling is ink is floating on top of the water, and then essentially you're putting a piece of paper down and lifting up, and you're essentially printing. So I loved this process because it allowed the medium to it was like a collaboration between myself and the medium, and I really, really enjoyed those aspects. So then I decided to turn those into portraiture. So doing this one right here is a self-portrait, and I became really interested not only in just the paper marbling itself, but I became really interested in psychology of color and what color can mean. So using my psychological background in studies and then combining it with my art practice, I decided to take the Lucier color test, which is a test that associates color with personality, and I got my models to essentially take this test, and then based on that, I would use those colors in the marbling in order to create these portraits. And that expanded into this whole figurative series of work where I became really interested in what color could mean. But then it kind of leads into the work that I do now, and I'll kind of talk more about that, but color has always had an overlying major theme in my work. So kind of the next 2 years, I graduated in 2016, I went to the Tyler School of Art in 2018. Great, amazing experience, the summer in painting and sculpture intensive. It allowed me kind of that nice jump start I felt like I needed after undergrad. I knew I wanted to go to grad school, but I wanted some more intense study. So while I was here, I decided to really push my painting abilities, but what I was really interested in was deconstructing a painting, and this idea that painting is surface, substrate, pigment in that way. So I became to kind of making these painting remixes where I started to kind of break down and work on different substrates, maybe removing certain substrates. I started experimenting with working on essentially translucent materials like chiffon, clear acrylic sheeting, shower curtains, literally anything to get my hands on, because I just wanted that experimentation. And I started making these pieces, and I felt like that really started to push my work into where it is now. And here are some up-close pieces of working also with paint skins, which I'll go a little bit more in depth, where I would pour acrylic paint onto sheets of plastic, more like 4 milliliter, like hard, like construction-based plastics. And then basically, since it's acrylic paint, acrylic only really sticks to acrylic, but since there's no acrylic on there, you can just pull them up. And they are like almost like pancakes of paint, I guess you could say. So I really became interested in working with those. And this is an example of that piece where I started to also think about, I always had this interest in sculpture, but I never understood how to get there as a traditionally trained painter. Sculpture scared the hell out of me, I guess you could say. But what was great was that when I was in the summer intensive there, I decided like, okay, how can I push my painting into sculpture? So with these paint skins, I decided to essentially sculpt these pieces, but also build them on the wall or make them in the spaces and make them almost site-specific installations, but with these paint skins. And I was really starting to look at these growths almost like fungi or lichen or something like that, and really exploring this. And that kind of moved on to this piece here, where I started to take those pieces of paint and I would roll them up into these little coils and put them on a three-dimensional, like undulating form, such as hard cloth. And this piece is called Contemplation. I will say it took me I think 350 hours of just nonstop working the whole time I was there in residency. And it was one of those things that I was trying to contemplate my next move, and I was like, okay, so this is where my painting is, where is it gonna go, what's happening next? So I decided at this moment in time, I was like, well, I guess it's time for me to go to grad school, so I really enjoyed this intensive, but I was like, all right, the next step, grad school. So from here, I kind of was figuring out my life, I guess you could say. Kind of here, this is me in my studio there at the Summer Painting Sculpture Intensive. You can kind of see that piece for scale. And there's me in that hot glue gun. I feel like I went through 5 hot glue guns, breaking them, getting burnt by them, everything. And this piece took way much more time than I thought, but it was really rewarding in the end. So now we're in 2019, so this is actually when I got to grad school. I started my first year at Ohio University in 2019, and I wanted to take my sculptures and push them further, but I knew at this point I wanted to keep pursuing sculpture with my paintings. So a lot of my paintings, I consider them sculptural paintings because they're still using paint, but using them in sculptural ways. So I started to push that. And I wanted to revisit natural elements such as lichen and fungi. So I kind of started developing my own kind of word for these. I call them acrylolichens. So almost like these acrylic pieces are growing from this log. And I kind of was starting to think of maybe a time in which, if we keep going the way we are with pollution, all that kind of stuff, it's like, what if this material just starts to grow on its own in the forest and things like that? But I also love this material because I liked making the material appear like it's something else. I think that's what really gets me kind of excited about all the works, is a lot of the works even here in the show that you guys may see, they get accused of being like wood or another plastic or material, but we'll talk more about the work here, but it's all made from paint. So with this is in 2020. This is when the pandemic started, kind of going into the pandemic. But what I decided to do was I needed to be away from people. So I decided to go out into the woods. And I was like, let me get away from all the people. And what if I make outdoor installations and really explore these ideas of this growth of this acrylolichen and turn into other fungi, but also seeing how it lives in nature. So I took that time and did some site-specific installations, and then this is kind of where it started to take off. So relating to a lot of my work back to the earth and thinking of these growth and consumptions, but also thinking about human impact on the environment as well, were a lot of questions that I was asking myself. So here we are here. This is more to now, but one thing is my main medium is discarded and mistint house paints. So one thing that I became really interested in was during the pandemic especially, there was an influx, in my opinion, from what I've looked around, of discarded and mistint house paints. Basically, since we had nowhere to go during the pandemic, people were renovating their houses, they were doing home improvement projects, things like that, and Lowe's and Home Depot or hardware stores were the few stores that were actually open during this time. So I saw so much house paint there, and I became really interested in what a mistint was, because mistint house paints are essentially, they're found in orphaned and hardware stores. They're unused or returned by the customers not satisfied with the finished product. Pretty much if you make a color and you're not liking it or it's too yellow than you wanted, then they take it and they'll sell it for a lower price, basically. So basically the lack of available colors and the difficulty in matching them is what makes it so hard to sell these paints. So I saw them as an opportunity to create some artwork from. And I almost saw that these paints as almost being like lost hopes and dreams. They were meant to be something, they were meant to be in someone's house, they were meant to be these things that we do for ourselves, to better ourselves, to create value, things like that. But essentially, they were just cast to the side. So I became really interested in how something can have a residual memory. So as you can see here, this is a photo with all the oops paint. It goes by mistints or oops paint, but the paint is sold at a much lower price, and they have so many varieties of it. And that was something that I just tried to get as much as I could during this time and kind of stockpile it. And then after I got all the paint, then I was kind of like, okay, now what do I do? So then I started going through and creating sculptures from it, which we'll go over. But before doing that, I feel like it's important to kind of go over some major influences that I was looking around at this time. So some of you guys may be familiar with Alberto Beri's work. So he was an Italian doctor that basically was a prisoner of war and started making pieces in World War II with surplus materials such as burlap and plastics, and would burn them and things like that. And since these were all in surplus post-war Italy, he used all these discarded materials, and I kind of saw a similar connection between the COVID-19 pandemic. Like there was all this surplus of material, and I was like, okay, so now this is the material I want to focus on and kind of create my artworks. So we also have Laura Moriarty, phenomenal artist. She makes these layered encaustic pieces that kind of resemble also some earth formations, but a lot of the pieces that she makes, the processes are related to how the earth is formed through folding, heat, transmutation, things like that, all these different processes that I kind of resonated with, and are a lot of the processes that I still do in my work as well. So I feel like it really fits. And this is this material transformation, which I really resonate with. Another big thing was kind of this movement known as the material art movement that happened primarily in the 80s in China. And what was so fantastic about these works that these artists really stuck out to me were these works involve an artist's use of unconventional materials to produce artworks where media rather than the image or style is paramount in establishing the artist's aesthetic and social critique. So really thinking about where I situate myself and where I see my work in contemporary art history. So I was really resonating with this material movement, and it's so, I'll show you some of the works from it, but it's just so brilliant how they use these materials and transform them to have this social commentary. So basically here is one of the works that I have looked at. This is Shan Yu, or He Shan Yu. And pretty much this installation that was created features black crystalline residue from boiling down thousands of liters of Coca-Cola. So this was something that really interested me, like this idea of having this consumer's good, something that's so popular, but boiling it down to make this like crystallized, almost like soil. It's quite beautiful in a way. So it's just like this material transformation is what really made me interested in this piece. Okay, and we also have Gul Dizing, who also is working with plastic, meat, and even fruit, definitely things that are not traditional art materials, but that was just something that's really interesting to me, and was one of the first artists to use unconventional materials in China. So this kind of goes over to my own practice. So this is me in my studio in graduate school. I will say I really miss that studio. Had great natural lighting, lots of floor space. But from here is kind of where I started to, I guess you could say, boil up those ideas and really to take off with what I'm doing today. And this was in my studio the summer before working on my graduate thesis exhibition. So I want to talk a little about my process and then kind of talk about one piece, and then I'll go through and kind of break the process down. So I think this is really helpful. So this piece is called Decentered, and for my works, and it's actually in this exhibition, it's on the back wall back there, if you guys want to take a look at it after the talk. But this piece is created with layers of mistint and discarded house paints. So that's something that in the Athens, Ohio community, I reached out to hardware stores, I would get the mistint paints. I would also reach out to landlords, friends, everyone that I knew in the community, and essentially, since discarded house paint, or just house paint in general, live in garages, basements, and things like that, I actually was able to accumulate a good amount of materials for my thesis show. And a lot of this work has to deal with the location because all the paint was collected within that certain location. So I became interested in this idea of how that is like a color story of that location. And I make different pieces based on where I'm living, and it's interesting just to kind of see the difference in color choices. Yes, a lot of them tend to be, older paints. Maybe they were from, the 80s or the 90s and just left in a can. A lot of the cans, they're so old that I can't necessarily tell when they were produced, but it's interesting to kind of see this color story through time, through there. And one thing I like to do is I like to speak about my work through the lens of archaeology and geology, almost like understanding our past civilizations, our past culture, our past uses of color. And with this piece, I would essentially make a tray, which I'll show you in a bit, and I pour layers of paint. So once one layer dries, another layer will be poured, give that 2 days to dry, another layer poured. So I typically will try to get them about like 5 inches thick, 4 or 5 inches is a sweet spot. And then basically from there, it will dry, and then I'll excavate it. And I'll use a variety of tools, such as a Dremel, a lot of woodworking tools, a reciprocator saw, and other hand saws as well. So excavated, and I really enjoy that these pieces take on geological forms. They look like geodes, they look like different sedimentary rock formations, things like that. And I like this idea of connecting it back to the interior spaces, because when we create a home, the closest thing that we build on that order of nature, essentially the same as when an animal builds a nest or whatnot. So those are things that really start to interest me, but also thinking about consumerism as well, and our consumer society, and kind of critiquing it, and also sustainability with these pieces, essentially with that paint that I discarded throughout my intervention, like what would happen to those? Would they be disposed of correctly? Would they just be thrown out in the landfills? There's certain ways to discard paint, and then you can take them to certain waste facilities and things like that. But I kind of decided to kind of take it as my own role to kind of be the recycler in the community and to take the paint and to create sculptures that kind of have social critique. So here's my studio here. As you can see, I have 2 trays that are at the bottom there. Essentially, those are filled with paint, and then I have the fans that are blowing to help speed up the process. Each one of these slabs that I make can take anywhere between 3 to 8 months. So I'm really interested in the time as well, in that process of time, especially with that piece that I showed you, Contemplation. It took 350 hours. So it's like one of those things that I'm not afraid of taking on a piece that will take a large amount of time. But just these processes in general is what I'm fascinated into, this layers of paint and then drying. Here I have a short little clip. This is my studio assistant, Emily Van Meter, during grad school here. You can see we made these trays and we started pouring layers of paint and then kind of swishing them around, I guess you can say, and then putting them down. And I try to get a good amount made at the same time. So I have almost like this assembly line in the studio where I'm like, okay, this time it's your turn to get carved, and then I'll have these other trays, and we're kind of just moving through, so I have stuff to do. And even if I don't have a long studio day that day, at least if I get in there and pour paint, I'm like, successful studio day. I joke around that I treat the studio as almost like the gym. I'm like, if I can just go for like 30 minutes, then we did something. So I definitely try to do the same thing in my studio where I just need to poke my head in, pour some paint, and then I'm like, we're good for the day. So here's going through, I made some larger slabs. This one is about, I think it was 5 feet by 6 feet, really heavy. It's like 200 pounds. That's one problem with my work is the larger it gets, the heavier it gets. So keeping it kind of 30 by 30, a little smaller, that's kind of the sweet spot because it can hang on the wall. I'm still interested in this idea of treating them like paintings, but also like sculptures. So for this piece here, this was one of my large floor pieces, and you can see that I'm starting to carve it with this reciprocator saw. And just going through and kind of excavating and digging out and uncovering those colors and revealing the colors within. I joke around that it's kind of like me salting the dig, which almost that term means that when during the gold rush, they would essentially, different people would put fake traces of gold in a mine and then be like, look, there's gold. And then people would excavate that, but then there might be gold over here and they're over here. You know, it's kind of like putting false gold in, or fool's gold, I guess you could say. But I kind of think of it not as that, but almost I'm kind of pouring the paint in, so I kind of know what's there, but also I don't, because when I'm carving, different layers, different textures and things like that will kind of come out. And I think that's just so interesting, this idea of process of layering. Here's an up-close shot of some of the caverns, I guess you could say, inside the piece. You can see that it almost looks like sedimentary rock. So each one of those colored layers is essentially a layer of paint, and then going in and just excavating and carving those sections out. So here's another piece. This piece is orogeny. This piece kind of helped me simplify my color palette. I became interested, okay, I have so much color, but now what do I do with it? So what I decided to do was thinking about what the color like white meant. Like white is this color that is used for purity, but it's also used to kind of start anew. You know, you might have a gallery wall, let's say a color or something like that, but when you give it a fresh coat of paint, you're starting over with white. It's almost like this erasure, but also this layering of the passing of time and talking about what with each of these pieces, I almost think of them being like being a wall. And if you were to carve back a wall, how many layers of paint would that essentially have? How many stories would those be able to tell? How many different spaces and things like that? But what I started to do was really kind of bury in other colors as well and treating white as that final top layer, almost like a top coat of a house or whatnot. With this piece here, this is strata. It's actually in the back as well. I'll play this short little video as I'm talking a little bit. So I became really interested in, these pieces are really relief-based, and they hang on the wall, but then I became interested in this idea of how can I make more freestanding sculptures. So I decided to make these smaller pedestal pieces that could live on a pedestal, but also incorporating other materials, and the other material I incorporated in this was plaster, and really thinking about what other construction-based materials can I add into this to help push my concepts, my ideas, and also, too, with these pieces, it takes so long to build up that I'm like, okay, how can I cut corners? Let me just make plaster pieces and put them inside, which the plaster didn't quite get me where I wanted to go, but I did enjoy chunks of it being throughout, almost looking like sediments in the rock that were just hardened in there, showing kind of other layers and other textures. I also work on panel as well. There's some pieces throughout the show that are in panel. I like this idea of working with a panel because it can relate back to the wall, thinking about how many layers are in that wall, that passage of time there, but also kind of keeping it still in the traditions of painting, really thinking about this idea that I am a painter, but I'm also working very sculpturally, but I like this idea that it reads still in the vein of painting, but it has definitely some sculptural elements. So in this panel here, there were sections of it that were cut out and excavated and revealing the layers underneath. And that's something that really interests me. I have some smaller ones that I've done. I want to work larger scale with this idea. And I've started one of the pieces that I want to do in the future is essentially make a false wall, but have it so I can kind of cut through it. But especially with time and space, that's a project that hopefully on the horizon very soon, but more if I can get some more space. That's one thing as an artist, you'll never have enough space, I feel like. Another thing that I really enjoy doing is thinking about paint as having this residual memory, this past history, but objects also have that. So what I decided to do is I started to think a lot about interior spaces. What are some objects that you would see in the everyday, maybe some decorative pieces and things like that. So I was thinking when I was going through a thrift shop, I started thinking like, wow, all these objects were at one point somewhere else. They were in someone's like grandmother's home, their home, whatnot, brother, sister's house, or something. So I started to think about those ideas, this residual memory, like where those have gone. I wish objects could talk and tell you like where they've been. So it's kind of this idea of thinking about those things. But then what I started to do was to find these thrift shop objects, and what I did was I would mold them in silicone. And this is also made out of paint. Where I would do is all the shavings from shaving all these pieces, they may essentially make a sawdust. I collected and jarred it all, and then what I would do is I'd put it in with resin to construct actual objects. This idea of also recycling, I try not to waste anything when I'm working, like everything has a purpose. I even use the paint can lid, which I will show in a second. But all the sawdust that's created from these pieces when I'm carving are used in, and even the metals of the cans as well. So I try to have little waste as possible, so when I get these paints, I use all of it. Here is an up-close and detail shot. You can see some of the different colors of some of the paint that are in there, some of the shavings in there as well, and then just all the different texture from that, from it being a mold casted object. Here's another piece here. That was another cast object. One sits here, and there's a twin in the back. I started really thinking about these shapes as architectural forms, thinking about they're almost like portals or windows into a space, the same with like the archways. So really thinking about these transportation devices, I guess you could say, that can bring you into the space or how you pass through a space. I'm also thinking about them as being windows as well. Really thinking about kind of those interior architectural parts, but also I enjoy that when they're casted, they look older, like they're older objects that have been like dug up or excavated from like an archeological dig. Also enjoy because some of the resin pieces, I'll intentionally yellow it so that it looks like it's older. So kind of this passage of time that's very apparent in the work and very much there. So here are some pieces that I put behind glass. I became interested in this idea that why do we put stuff in picture frames or behind glass? They're things that typically tend to hold value for us. Maybe they're family photos, maybe it's a display case or something of an object of importance. So what I started doing was I started to find these carvings that looked like they're coarse geological rocks from my pieces, and I decided to essentially put them in frames and to add more of a layered value behind it. And that's one thing I enjoy, especially in the show. You'll see that not everything is completely eye level. I like this idea of shifting because I want it to relate to the interior space. This piece is called Mineral Collector. So I think about this idea of collecting objects that hold value. And it's kind of interesting too because since this is consumer waste, it's essentially framed in that same aspect of being something of importance within like a house or a museum. So those are just questions I really start to ask about how much we value our own consumers' cultures. So here's one of the pieces that, the paint can lid piece that I did mention earlier. It's called Remnants. From my thesis show, what I decided to do, from all the pieces that I created, and there a lot of them are here, I decided to keep the paint can lid for and to make a wall of these paint can lids. So what it is, it also shows you the color that went into the show, but all the paint that I used to actually create that show was there, and the lid was there as a record. So this piece was I think it was 165 paint can lids. So that's how many containers of paint it took to make the work, basically. And I enjoy it because it almost looks like a Seurat like dot painting or something with Chuck Close. You know, there's so many different reads in this, but also they're just very beautiful because you can see the rust on the cans, you can see the history on these. It's almost like having a map, like a map to talk about like the archeological dig in a way, or a point of locator. Here is some images from the show here. Ideally, when I hang the sculptural works, I do like to paint the wall so that it essentially ties in the color that what paint is traditionally used for and what I transformed it into. So kind of relating the whole idea back to a painting with those painted areas. So you can see the blue and purple piece here. The walls are painted and the sculptures are hanging in front of it. And then once again, working with kind of this cascading of the pieces relating to the interior, and then having some pieces on pedestals, but also vitrines, because it's also kind of that idea of putting them behind glass, that they have significance or value. There's another piece here. The floor piece was the one that I was talking about and the one that I was carving out in a previous slide. It weighs like 200 pounds. I only made one of them, and I don't know if I'll ever go that big again. It's kind of a pain to travel with. So these are just some things that I'm doing now. This is foliated. It's in the back on the pedestal. I became really interested. I really want to push this idea of making more sculptures in the round. A lot of, as you can see in the show, a lot of them live on the wall, which I enjoy that as being a traditional painter or having a background as a painter. But I want some more freestanding sculptures. So this idea of trying to create more pieces that are sculpted, but I'm right now in this weird place where I don't like pedestals, so I'm trying to also figure out a way of making my own type of pedestal structure that the pieces could sit on. But ideally, I would like some larger pieces that you can enjoy by walking around and engage with. So this is kind of one of the first steps in that way, but it's definitely not the size I want to make. It's about 6 by 6, so one day, hopefully, like 5 times larger. Here's another piece. This piece particularly is what I wanted to show because I'm really interested in this way of working modularly. Basically this idea that since these pieces get so heavy, I can only make them so large. But this idea that if I have multiple components, I could start installing them into a space and really think about installation and how they interact with the space, doing some other site-specific things as well. I think this piece is not there. I'm proud of it, but there's moments where I'm like, oh, I wish I would have done something a little different, but that's okay. It's never a failed experiment. You can always learn from it. So I'm really grateful that I have this piece, but my idea is to kind of cut it up more and have more of it to take up more space. And I really want to start installing in like the corners of the rooms, areas that typically don't house sculptures or paintings, also ceilings and things like that. I think would be really interesting to kind of engage and challenge the traditional gallery space. This was one of my most recent pieces, Moonstone. I like showing this piece because this piece is not here in the show, but at least it has some things that I'm really interested in and things that are really successful about it, in my opinion. So with this piece, I kind of started to use the white again, but I started to bury sections of other paintings or scraps that I didn't really enjoy, but also kind of starting anew almost. And I feel like that's kind of where I am with my practice, is burying it underneath all these different layers of white paint, and then going through and excavating, but then putting it back, basically, is what I was kind of interested in, where I actually made some white resin and poured it back in to give more of this shimmer or this area, this idea of like layers, kind of using, I guess, playing hide and seek almost in a way, where it's not directly there to the viewer, but there is something there disrupting it, but it's enough that you can still see through it. And I think this relates back to my original works with Tyler when I was making things on chiffon and things like that. There was a lot of components that were essentially at the viewer, some were hiding, and some were distorted in some way. So I definitely see kind of my older work resonating and coming forth in some newer stuff. And then this piece is actually the most recent thing that I did make. I did a 2-week workshop at the Penland School of Craft, in Bakersville, North Carolina. And when I was there, I did a wood joinery workshop. And I've always been interested in how I can add more materials back into my practice. And I've really been interested in wood lately. So what I decided to do while I was there, I wanted to make essentially a work that typically I do now, but make it strictly out of found wood. So everything here was wood that I found. I went dumpster diving, all the dumpster diving, finding some wood, other scraps around the wood shop. And I decided to essentially make this rock formation. But there's one thing I hate. I'm starting to not like pedestals. So this idea of what can I build that can become part of the sculpture so that it doesn't need a pedestal. The pedestal could be built in or integrated into the work. So I think this is successful in that nature. I wish it was a little bit bigger, and I only had 2 weeks, so I really had to crank this piece out. But I think this is a good foundation and building block for kind of what I want to start doing. I want to start building my own pedestals and have the pieces integrated into it, or part of the pedestal, or the pedestal be the piece, but have chunks out of it with revealing sedimentary sections. So that's kind of some things that I'm thinking of at the moment. So that kind of brings us here to The Forgotten. That is the name of the exhibition that you guys are currently standing in. I like this idea because relating to these forgotten paints, these forgotten memories, these forgotten intentions, basically relating it back to the material itself, which is the discarded mist-tint house paint, is what I was really interested in. And that was something I kind of want to like tell the story of these paints, but almost through my own intervention, or salvaging these paints to create these other sculptures that are here and living in a different vein, essentially. So then I just have some images of the overall reception area, or the exhibition, I guess you could say, just so you can kind of see it. I know there's some that are disrupted at the moment. So really thinking about this idea of relating all this back to the interior space and how they're cascading and how they are being displayed. I don't really enjoy doing shows where everything is strictly eye level. For me personally, I think I need more movement. So I think I really enjoy this idea of using unconventional materials, unconventional ways of displaying, and just really challenging these spaces that we're initially in, especially the gallery space. And there are those pieces there. And that's all I have for you. Thank you so much.